Hello, folks. Welcome to the Manly Pinterest Tip Show. I'm Jeff C., and you're not. And we have a great show in store for you today. We have Mr. Mike Allton here on the show. And if you don't know who Mike is, he's a prolific writer and blogger who has written for Social Media Today and has recently published his first book called The Unofficial Book on Hootsuite, which is a fabulous resource if you're using or even thinking about using that social media tool. He's active in all the major social media platforms. He's most active on Google+, where he has over 158,000 followers, and he has actually amassed 12,000 followers over on Pinterest. So, Mike, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Jeff. It is awesome to be here, man.
Hey, man, thanks for doing this for me. I really appreciate it. Here's what we're going to do today. Here's kind of the format for the show. I'm going to pick Mike's brain with some questions about how blogging and Pinterest kind of work together, and then hopefully we're going to take some questions from the live audience. So if you have questions for Mike or some of his answers that when we're talking back and forth spawn some questions that you would like answered, go ahead and ask away in the comments, and we will really try to get to those during the show today. So we'd also love for you to head over to www.manlypinteresttips.com and subscribe to our email community. That way you'll never miss one of these exciting live shows. We'll go ahead and send you an email on that. So if you do that, I really appreciate it. So let's get started, Mike, and dive right in. Here's the first question I'd like to ask you. Now, kind of tell us a little overview of your blogging journey. What's exactly your background in blogging and kind of why you got started.
Sure. Well, it started when I was in a crib, and my mom put a pencil in my tiny little chubby hands, and I started blogging.
Gotcha.
A little tiny Hercules blogger. No, I started years ago when I had my own business, and I started blogging because, like a lot of people, I was told that I should. I was told that was the way to add new content to your site and to kind of get the word out that who you were and what you did. And interestingly, I found that I actually really liked to write, and I never really noticed that. I did well in English classes in high school and college. I was a history major in college and did a lot of writing for those history classes, but never liked it because that was handwriting, and I hate to write by hand.
Right.
Absolutely hate it. But you put me in front of a computer where I could type and I can massage the language and I can move sentences and paragraphs around and really focus on communicating an idea or a concept or teaching. That I love. So that's kind of where I started. I started blogging and found that I really enjoyed it, and it kind of took off from there. The past couple of years, really more last year than anything else, I was blogging 6 to 12 times a day. Or not a day, a week. 6 to 12 a week. And I would be writing articles. I would be writing about current events in social media, content marketing, and just sharing my knowledge.
Wow. So, like today, what's your schedule for blogging? I mean, do you get up first and write so many paragraphs before you have your morning coffee, or do you just write up some blog ideas, or kind of what's your structure on how you kind of come up with your articles?
Sure, and I'm glad you asked, because this is something that I really encourage people to come up with. Now, the individual schedule that you keep will change and will vary from person to person. In fact, most people probably should not have the kind of writing schedule that I do. Most of my clients, I encourage them to have a set time each day, maybe an hour, half an hour, however much time they can afford to devote, and have that blocked off. It's part of their schedule and their routine every single day. Personally, I'm not that way. I do most of my writing on the weekends. Saturday and Sunday afternoons typically are time that I have to myself. I've got a little girl. She's usually sleeping, which means my wife is usually sleeping too. So I've got a nice 2 or 3 hour block of time almost every weekend day where I can write as much as I want to. So I'll sit someplace with my iPad and bang out maybe several articles, or maybe one really long article in an afternoon. So then during the week, any time that I'm spending on blogging is really publishing the work that I've already done, promoting some of that work, or if something happens on the fly, like last night's Pinterest news, if I have the time and I have the interest and it makes sense, then I'll drop what I'm doing and write about that particular event.
Gotcha. And we'll talk about that Pinterest news later on in the show. But so how do you come up with your the ideas that you get for your blogging titles or ideas? I mean, because that kind of will tie in later to when people come up for ideas for pins or stuff like that. How do you come up with those initial ideas? I mean, do you have a set aside time where you're just going to brainstorm and do a brain dump on paper, or how do you do that?
That's a great question, because there is two different ways to do that. The first thing to understand here is that I use Evernote as my blogging system, and it's a process I've talked about a lot, and we're not going to go into too much detail about today. But Evernote, if you've never used it, is a note-taking tool, and all of your notes live in the cloud. So you can have Evernote on your laptop, and you can have Evernote on your iPad or your iPhone, and anywhere you're at. If you have an idea for something that you want to write about, you can jump into Evernote and jot that down, and that idea will be there waiting for you later when you have time to actually sit down and flush that out. So that said, I do have one single note where every once in a while I will just say, okay, I want to brainstorm some ideas. I'll go in there and I'll just start writing down ideas. And typically it's going to be questions that either I have or I think my audience might have. For instance, how do I start a Facebook ad campaign? Or how do I create a board on Pinterest? Or how do I embed a Pinterest board into a blog post? These are questions that I know other people have. And if I could think of at least one other person who has that question, it's probably worth writing about it in a blog post.
Gotcha. I think a lot of those, those steps you just gave are also great ideas if people are starting to try to come up with ideas with what to pin about, what kind of images to create for their pins. That kind of brainstorming sequence you just gave, I think, is really helpful. So I want to jump into the next question. You use, and I know because I follow you on Pinterest, is you use it almost daily. And so what drew you to the Pinterest platform in the first place?
And that's interesting because, again, honestly, it was probably people telling me, you need to do this. I try to spend time, at least a little bit, every day on virtually every social platform, and not just the big four. I mean, I'll spend a little bit of time on StumbleUpon, a little bit of time on Dig, and Instagram and YouTube and so on. And I do that because I think it's my professional responsibility to. I want to be able to talk to my clients about every social platform and give them recommendations on specifically which platforms are best for them. So even though I spend the most time on Google+, that may not necessarily be the #1 recommendation I might have for business, depending on who they are and who they're trying to reach. So that's how I started on Pinterest. As a blogger, I wanted to get my content out in front of as many people as possible, and I wanted to be able to talk about all these different platforms. So I had a profile on Pinterest, and I created some boards on Pinterest and started to use it. But then I started to listen to people like yourself and Peg Fitzpatrick, and who are telling me, Mike, you could do a little bit better on Pinterest. You could be pinning other people's stuff. You could be creating different kinds of boards. You could show some personality and have some of your own personal interests pinning on Pinterest. So that's really when my Pinterest activity took off. Mm. And I've noticed that about myself and most people on every social media platform. You start off, you're a noob, you don't know what's going on, you don't really know way to use it, and frankly, you're going to use it wrong for a while. And then usually, hopefully, there's a light bulb moment where you say, oh, I could be doing this, or I could be using it this way, or I could be changing what I'm doing and using these techniques and be so much more effective in what I'm doing and what I'm getting out of the network. And so that happened for me on Google+, late 2012, early 2013, and the same thing happened for me earlier last year with Pinterest.
Gotcha. Yeah, I think that's an incredibly important point, is that it's, especially on Pinterest, I think it's really important to share your personality. And Peg Fitzpatrick told me the same advice, was to, it's okay not just to pin, if you're a marketer, not just to pin marketing stuff. In fact, one of my most popular boards is my geek board, and I know you follow it and you see stuff. And I think it shows my followers that I'm a real person and I have interests, and they enjoy that, and that connection kind of deepens when you have those personal connections. So that was a really good point. Now, we're going to dive into kind of one of the biggest questions, and I know especially men ask this. Pinterest is most actively used in the U.S. by women. I think it's like 80% is what they're rattling around. Um, why do you think that is? Why do you think it's men are having such a hard time breaking into that?
Well, that's a good question. My gut is that it started off as a platform that really more easily catered to some of the topics that are interesting by default to women. Fashion and food and crafting and these kinds of things, very visual, very personal. And so the culture has evolved in that direction. And again, we see this on every social network. There's little micro societies, little cultures that evolve and develop, and it's really hard to change them. I know Pinterest has made some new hires, and they're trying to change the perception. They're trying to change the use, to get more men involved, and that's going to be a challenge. But the real trick here, and the same thing I tell every client, is find some things that interest you personally, and make sure that's a part of your Pinterest strategy. Like I've got a travel board, and this is super easy for me. I mean, it's so easy to log into Pinterest twice a day and find beautiful pictures of exotic destinations or even domestic destinations, and to pin them to my travel board, because those are places I would love, honestly, to go someday. And if I don't see them on my stream, maybe I'll do a search. Like one day, I might just do a search on castles, because that's one of my goals, is at some point to go to England and Europe on just a castle touring trip. So now I'm going to be able to go into my travel board, and I'm going to be able to find all kinds of pins of castles all over Europe that I can go back and see. And it's something that's personally interesting to me, and I can tell by the likes and the repins that at least some of my followers think they're kind of cool looking.
Yeah, and I think that's what men don't realize, is they can really use it as a resource. It's a virtual pin board, and men are visual. I mean, they really are, and so I think it's there's so many opportunities there just personally where you can, if you're into barbecue pits and you're trying to research how to build your own barbecue pit, you could pin tons of stuff and find great articles on how to do that yourself. Do it yourself is huge on Pinterest, and I think more as, Lowe's, I know, does it, and some other big brands really hits that market hard. I think it's going to increase, and it's not going to be such of it's a woman's network kind of a thing. Do you think men let's say you're using Pinterest for business, do you think men are an advantage or a disadvantage on Pinterest right now? And do you see any opportunities for businesses there on Pinterest?
Well, that's an interesting question. I guess I wouldn't say that men are either at a disadvantage or advantage. I think potentially maybe the only advantage might be the fact that there aren't a lot of other men using it. So if you jump into Pinterest and you start being active as a man doing manly things, that's a real opportunity for you to be a trendsetter. I mean, you and I know one of the first mainly Pinterest shows was what was his name from Australia?
Yeah, Luke Dean Weimar.
Luke. Yeah, he's got 1 million followers on Pinterest. That's incredible. I don't have 1 million followers anywhere. You combine all my social networks, I still don't have 1 million followers. I don't even have 250,000 followers. And I am super active, and he's just out there taking incredible shots. He's, I don't know, riding sharks or something.
Right.
Great pins. And he's being a trendsetter. I mean, he's blazing that trail. But yeah, to get to the second part of your question, can Pinterest be used by business? Absolutely. Now again, I'll be the first to admit, it's not the best platform for every business. Right. So as I'm sitting down with a client, I'm talking to them, and we're figuring out, okay, who are they? What do they do? Who are they trying to reach? What can they create in terms of content and strategy and that sort of thing? Then we figure out, okay, well, which social network or networks make the most sense? And if you can't create any kind of visual assets at all, okay, well then Pinterest isn't for you. You have to pin a picture or video one way or another.
Right.
So
yeah,
then it's a huge benefit.
So let's bring it around to maybe why people even tune in. Pinterest and blogging. I mean, you see it coming up in your streams all the time, and it says that if you're a blogger, you need to be on Pinterest. Why is that?
2 reasons, and the first reason has to do with the creation of the blogs, because you kind of mentioned that before. You asked me, where do I get my ideas? Being active on a social network will give you ideas for new blog posts. And Pinterest is a perfect example. Twice a day, I jump into Pinterest and I just start sifting through my home stream to see what other people that I'm following have pinned recently. And it never fails that somebody's going to pin something that really jumps out at me. It might be an infographic, it might be an article that they found, or a quote, something. And it never fails. I will get an idea for a blog post of my own based on that pin. And it might be as simple as taking the infographic and blogging about that infographic. I've done that before. You can go and grab, people create infographics for the sole purpose of having you embed them on your site. That's what they want you to do. Right. So if you take that infographic, you embed it on a blog post, and you talk about it, you summarize it, say, why is this interesting, or why is it horrible? I don't know. You could go either way on that. That's a blog post right there, and it wasn't that hard. You didn't even have to create the infographic. You just took it. Obviously, you give them credit. You link back to the site where it came from, because hopefully if they did it right, their name will be here at the bottom of the infographic, and you're all set. So that's the first half of Pinterest, and frankly, that alone should be worthwhile for any blogger, because most bloggers struggle with ideas for the next blog post. Okay, so if you follow that kind of advice, you'll never have any lack of ideas. But the real big benefit is that long-term traffic. So when I pin something to Pinterest, that pin lasts forever. It really does. We talk about the lifespan of a status update, okay, on social media, and Twitter's the one that's really notorious. If you share something to Twitter as a tweet, the lifespan of that tweet is currently estimated to be about 18 minutes, which means that's the half-life. So after 18 minutes, half as many people have total have seen that, and after 36 minutes, another half, and so by the end of the day, it's likely that no one will ever see that tweet again. And that's just the way it works. Facebook status updates, Google Plus status updates, LinkedIn status updates, they're all the same. They have a limited lifespan. Google Plus is probably the best of those four, because they'll come up in search, and I'll have a Google Plus post that's months old, and somebody will find it seemingly and leave a comment. But Pinterest has the longest lifespan. Those pins just keep getting repinned and liked over and over again. And each time one of those pins gets shared again, that's a link to your website, to your blog post, whatever it is that pin links to, that somebody can click on and rediscover your content.
Yeah, I think that to me was the biggest thing when I first started. It was like there's all these points out there that are driving back to my my blog or website, and you're right, because I'll see pins I'm like, I forgot I pinned that. I forgot I even created that image, and somebody else found it and repinned it, and it's driving traffic back to the site. And it's true. It's stuff's coming back, and it's just that to me is one of the biggest reasons to really try to think about your Pinterest strategy and the best way to do it. Speaking of that, let's say I'm a blogger. I'm a new blogger, and I struggle. I've got to write. I'm struggling with writing. Like you said, it's hard to get those next articles coming out. And now I've got to come up with an image for my pin, which is just another hurdle that I've got to go. What advice would you give that person when they're trying to think, okay, I finally got an article done, and I see this happen a lot, is these new bloggers will slap up any old image and throw it up on Pinterest. What advice would you give that new blogger, on creating, high quality pins?
Absolutely. Don't do that. Do not grab clip art. Do not do a Google image search and just grab the first image you see. Do not do that. And trust me, I used to do it. I was that guy. I would just grab whatever image made sense. I did always use, copyright-free image, royalty-free image, that kind of stuff. But still, they're just random images. And the point I'm trying to make here is, if you separate your image from your blog post, and if all I'm doing is looking at the image, will I be able to see a connection between that image and your blog post? And if I can't, then you need to either pick a different image or do something else. Treat that image, which I'll get to in a second. But a perfect example is last year I was still doing the random image with a blog post deal, and one of my best blog posts of all time, I hit 16,000 shares in one day of this blog post. I had an image of a crumbling foundation, and I thought this was brilliant in my mind because this is what I was talking about in my share to Google+. I was talking about crumbling foundations and whatnot. The picture has nothing to do with the post. If you look at that post today, you're looking at this picture of a house's foundation, and you're like, okay, whatever. And if I show you that picture, you have no idea that it's tied to that blog post. So to this day, it's one of those things where I want to go back and fix that, and I wish I could go back in time and fix it from the beginning, but I can't.
Right.
So to all of you listening to me right now, pay attention. Make this change today so you don't have these regrets like I do. So start with a great image, a picture or an image that you can create yourself, a graphic of some kind, and add text. Have the title of your blog post or a version of the title, something that relates the content of the image to the content of your post, and have some branding on there. Your logo, your website name, your URL, something. Number one, so that there's a visual cue from that image to who it came from. Secondly, so other people can't so easily steal your image. Okay, so have that branding on there. So here's where Peg's going to love me because I'm going to give a shout out to Canva. I love Canva. Canva.com. And I know you do too, Jeff, but for all of you listening, if you haven't used Canva, it's a basically free online graphic creation tool. It's not just image editing. I used to use Mac Preview to edit my images. So there's you can go back to my blog post. It's kind of funny. If you could see all of my images in a row, you could see when I started using Canva. You could see when I started using Mac Preview to just add some basic text, and you can see where I wasn't doing anything. So you can see the evolution of the quality of my images. But with Canva, you can bring in graphics and colors and shapes and different things, so you don't even have to use a picture if you don't want to. You can create a basic style and template for your post, which is something I've been toying with a lot recently. If you look at my last, 5 or 6 blog posts, you'll see most of them all have the same style of image that's associated with them, with just some differences in content and textures and so on. Rebecca Radice is probably, you probably agree, is probably one of the best at this, along with maybe Dustin Stout, at having a consistent style to all of her graphics. When you see one of her images, you don't have to read it. You know that can't. Oh, yeah, that's one of Rebecca's. That's got to be one of her blog posts.
Right, I think that's very important because another person who does that is Ashley Fawkes out of Switzerland, and it's his. And so, when you get on Pinterest and you are pinning consistently good content that's helpful to people, then there's another connection that's made. Oh, I already know I don't even almost have to click through. I know that it's good. I already know that Mike's sharing something good. I already know that Rebecca's sharing something good. And so, number one, have great content, but number two, having that branded style of image, I think, is huge for just that almost, don't even have to think about it, connection to this person has good stuff. I know what it looks like. So
that's absolutely right, because we all want people who see our posts on social media to click through and read the article. We all want that. The reality is that doesn't happen. The reality is that only happens a fraction of the time. Okay, most of the people who see our status updates, they move on. And then a portion of those people will +1 it, or like it, or share it, or retweet it, or repin it, and they still won't click through to it. Okay, a good number of the people who repin my pins don't actually click through the pin to the actual content, but they're repinning it because they know me, or they know my content, they know what I'm sharing is quality stuff. So you do that, like Jeff said, by having a reputation, by consistently putting out quality stuff. Make sure, for instance, on Pinterest, your profile pic is the same as it is everywhere else, so they can recognize you in the stream. Oh yeah, that's Mike. I'm gonna, I like what he says. I like what he does. I like what Jeff puts out. I'm gonna take a look at that pin versus a total stranger or somebody that they don't maybe know as well. So that's good branding right there. And then to get back to the images, if you get a consistent style with your images, that's a huge, huge thing. So use Canva. One of the trickier things here is that for most of us on our blog posts, probably the best size of an image is going to be a landscape of some kind that appears at the top of the image. Like for my posts, all of my images are 700 by 350. And unfortunately, that's not the best size for pinning. So if you can, you want to either have a larger image on your blog post or have a second image specifically for Pinterest that's taller. 600 by 900 is what most people would agree is an ideal image for Pinterest. You might even go a little bit bigger. But that portrait style as a large image, that's what's going to get people's attention on Pinterest.
Right. I think also that Canva already has some of those dimensions already set up for Pinterest, and so that's already set up for you if you want to go there. The question I was going to ask you, I know that I've seen you do both the horizontal and vertical images, and so are there certain posts that you say, well, this one's extra special, so I'm going to make a Pinterest pin for, or how do you kind of think that through in your mind?
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think about the article that I'm writing. How important is it to me? How much time do I have? And then lastly, how do I think that particular article is going to play on Pinterest? If you're doing this for a while, you'll start to get a feel for your Pinterest audience and what they're interested in versus other platforms. I have a pretty good idea nowadays how an article is going to fly on Pinterest versus, say, Google+, versus, say, Twitter. It's frankly usually a little bit easier for me because if I'm writing about one of those platforms, it's going to do really well on that platform. But if I'm writing about blogging in general, which I often do, those are the kinds of posts where I'll give it some thought. So one of the tricks that I'll do, and that Canva has made so much easier for me, is I'll create an infograph. But I've got a blog post coming out hopefully next week about how I use Canva to create an infograph. And believe me, if I can create an infograph in Canva, you can create an infograph in Canva because I have zero design skills. None. I'm awful at graphic design. But Canva's made it so easy, and I don't mean to be this thing to turn this into the Canva commercial show, but I really believe in that particular product. And most people will know me by reading my stuff. If I believe in something, I'm going to share it with you. So this has really helped me. It's helped me with my blog posts, with my Google+, and it's really helped me tremendously on Pinterest. Creating some infographics, if you can, that tie into the blog post that you're writing. And if you can't create an infographic, create a tall graphic. And if you have to keep that separate from the blog post, you can. But if you can create a different graphic and embed that into the blog post, that's going to make your Pinterest strategy all that much more effective. And there's one other tip I wanted to share here about that too. If you can add multiple images into your blog post, have one at the top, but have one or two other ones down below that obviously relate to the blog post and help explain something, that's so perfect for Pinterest because you can pin each one of those images separately and not look repetitive on Pinterest.
Right.
That's a problem we have on Facebook and Google+. If I wrote an article today, this morning, and I want to share it again midday, and I want to share it again this evening, it's going to look really hard. It's going to be hard for me to not look repetitive on those platforms. Pinterest, that's no problem at all. Pin those pins.
Yeah, and I know that's a strategy that I've seen both Peg Fitzpatrick and Rebecca Radish use, is that they'll go back to old blog posts and actually change up the image and repin it to the board that it has to do with. And I think that's genius because that brings it to a whole other audience who hadn't seen it before, and it doesn't look like you're just repinning the same pin all the time. It's actually a different image. Now, it does take more work, but I think the payoffs for that is huge. So, hey, I want to go real quick. We have some questions from our audience, Mike, that I would like you to maybe chime in on. Number one is from Mobloggy. How much time do you spend on Pinterest a week?
That is a great question. And I think, Jeff, you and I are almost identical because I know I'm almost always on Pinterest 5 minutes after you or 5 minutes before you. So we're always seeing each other's pins. So we do the same thing. Every morning, every evening, without fail, we are on Pinterest for really just 5 or 10 minutes. So that's 7 days a week, 10 to 20 minutes a day. That's not a huge time commitment. Now, there is some setup and some maintenance that you're going to do up front and every once in a while. You've got to create boards. And those boards need to be, frankly, fairly specific. You know, when I started off, I had a social media board. Okay, well, that was kind of dumb. You know, I mean, it was just a new mistake. It's just too vague. People aren't interested in a social media board. They're interested in Google Plus resources. They're interested in Instagram resources. They're interested in Pinterest resources. So that's how I set up my boards once I had a clue about how Pinterest really works. So the more specific and detailed you can get your boards and what you're putting in there, the more likely you are to get followers, frankly. And the easier it is for you to decide if you're looking at a pin that's interesting, well, which board do you put it in? Now you know. So that's how much time I spend.
Yeah, I actually have a social media board, by the way, but I do have the other ones too, but that's kind of my general one, so I still have that. Here's another question by Laura B. Williams in our live audience. She says, because some of my accounts that I manage are sensitive, I read everything. The other thing is that I double-check pins to make sure they link to something that makes sense to the graphic. Why? Because everything I place online has a reflection on my reputation. That's huge. I think, you know, that's one of the, and I made that mistake when I first started as well, is I'd see something and pin it. Well, a lot of that would be spam to go buy a product or something, you know, and so there is spam on Pinterest that you have to look out for. But Laura is totally right that you need to check those links to make sure they're looking good. And that's, you know, and also because Laura always pins great stuff, you know, people expect that from her, and if something happened, they were like, why did she pin that? And so, very good point, Laura. Thank you so much for sharing. Another thing, Mike, you said, you know, how much time you spend on Pinterest. I spend about the same amount of time, but I spend a lot of time reading articles because there's so many jump off spots to some great, you know, resources on Pinterest. So I spend less amount of time on Pinterest, but I do spend a lot of time reading everything. So here's another question from our audience. Good tips. This is from Kathleen Russell. Good tips on how to integrate your blogs into Pinterest. Love Canva. Need to figure out a little bit more. And hopefully we'll have somebody from Canva on here sometime. And here's her question. What could Pinterest be doing to make it more manly? Do they discuss this strategy? It's always been a joke that men are more visual, but Pinterest appears to be targeting women. Well, I think, and you can chime in too, Mike, I think that they really are trying to strategize to get more men on the U.S. I think overseas it's a little more equal, but here in the U.S., if you notice Pinterest lately, their new videos, most of those all were about men, you know, looking at beard boards and working on their motorcycles. So I think that's kind of happening. What do you think?
Yeah, and it's funny because, like I was saying before, there's a culture that has evolved. and to answer Catherine's first question, did they discuss the strategy? Oh yeah, they just hired the former marketing director, I guess, of Axe. At least he was responsible for the Axe commercials and Axe campaigns. So he's a ladies' man kind of a guy, and they're hoping that he can bring some added or new energy and some different ideas to their marketing campaigns. I don't know. I don't know if that's going to really work because there's a culture there. And really, when it gets down to it, Pinterest isn't for men or for women. It's just a tool. And it's up to us to decide how we're going to use it. So I guess if Pinterest wants more men to use Pinterest, then ad campaigns and awareness campaigns and those kinds of things may help. But ultimately, it's up to men to realize this is a tool that they can use. This is a tool that they can enjoy and have fun with, and it doesn't necessarily mean looking at a stream of makeup tips and press-on nails. They could be looking at streams of gadgets and travel pictures and food. Manly food. And I saw what I see yesterday. I saw somebody barbecuing over some kind of molten steel pit. I mean, it was just crazy, and they're like, putting steaks on this thing. I mean, it doesn't get any more manly than that.
That's right. That's right. And then, I saw recently they had a big Darth Vader helmet barbecue, which I thought was really cool. So let's talk about what's happening now that just came out yesterday. If you're listening to this later, that Pinterest just came out with messaging. It's a pretty big deal. I was on Kelly Lieberman's Pin Chat last night, and that's all they talked about. So there's a lot of excitement behind this, a lot of some cool ideas coming out of it. Before Pinterest, that was one of the things that people say, it's not really social. I mean, you could use comments, but half the time the comments wouldn't work right. I remember one time I tagged Mike, and it turned into Mike Damien Allton, and I thought his head was going to spin around and he's going to start throwing up green stuff. But so they need to fix that. But this new messaging thing seems like it's really going to help that social layer. I'm pretty excited about it. I think it's part of what Pinterest was missing. What do you think, Mike?
Oh, I couldn't agree more. Particularly about the comments thing. I don't particularly like being called Mike Damien Allton. And it's always been a little bit of a shame that we're spending time on Pinterest, we're following each other, we're finding new people, and we're not really able to engage with those people, if at all, very clumsily, with the comments being what they are. And I know you've sent me pins in the past, and I'd love to be able to just respond to that pin and say, hey, thanks, Jeff, or why the heck did you send this to me?
Right.
'Cause there's no context to it, and that's what's been fixed. We can now send pins back and forth with each other. We can send pins to multiple people, and we can add text and have a conversation. So I talked about that in an article today about how this is a lot like Google Plus Hangouts. There's no video aspect, but you can have a perpetual hangout, a perpetual chat discussion going on that you can just jump back into whenever you need to with one or more people. And that's where real communication, dialogue, and collaboration can happen.
Yeah, they were talking on the Pin Chat last night, even having, especially brands could have a VIP where they send out messages to certain people who follow a certain board. I mean, I think there's just so many opportunities there. And you mentioned in your article today, and we'll make sure we put that in the show notes, is that one of the things that bloggers can collaborate on an article. Businesses can work together and visually plan some strategy. So I think it's a kind of a big deal, especially for people who are already on Pinterest.
Oh yeah, and like I said, the collaboration thing's a big deal because I'm trying to work more and more with other bloggers on coming up with really great ideas for blog posts. Like you probably know Jason Frasca. He's an Evernote consultant.
Right.
He's actually written a book on Evernote. So I've written a book on Hootsuite. He's written a book on Evernote. So let's blog together. So we're actually working on a blog post, and it's going to be how you can use Evernote and Hootsuite together. And doesn't really apply to this particular topic, but if you've got a topic where there are pins out there that support what you're writing about, you could be sending pins back and forth. You could be saving those pins to a secret board that's a private board that nobody else can see, but that you can jump into and refer back to those pins later, and really hone and develop that idea into a really powerful blog post.
Yeah, I think it's just going to be neat to see how companies use this coming up in the future. One thing I forgot to ask you that I wanted to make sure to talk about is it important for bloggers to be active on group boards? I mean, a lot of people are on group boards, and you can get a bigger audience that way. Is that important for a new blogger to, when they first start out, to be kind of looking for maybe some group boards they can ask to join or join some open ones? What do you think about that?
Yeah, and here's the thing. You're partly spot on in that the group boards are really important, really great opportunities for you to expand your reach, meet other people, engage, and now collaborate with those people. But the caution that I'd give you is if you're a new blogger, don't push it. Don't try to force yourself into a group board. And this is really, frankly, the same on every social network. When you're meeting people on Google Plus or Facebook or Twitter, you don't want to be too pushy. You don't want to ask people to retweet you and they don't know who you are. You don't want to ask people to share your stuff on Google Plus and they've never had a conversation with you before in their lives. And definitely do not send me requests to get into my group boards if you've never pinned any of my stuff or commented on my pins or made any attempt to get to know me. So I don't know you. I don't know what you're pinning. I don't know if you're going to be sharing quality pins with the board or just spamming it. So that first step, that first critical step, is to be sharing great content and using that to create relationships and allowing those kinds of things to develop a little organically. Once you've done that for a while and you've got some relationships with people and you see that they've got a good group board, well, then, talk to them about it. But that's not the first step.
Gotcha. All right, as we wrap this up, I wanted to kind of circle back and say, okay, what advice would you give to a new blogger starting out on how to maximize Pinterest? And you talked about, right now is not to push yourself on group boards. You want to have really good images. What else would you add to that list of a new blogger? Here's what I tell you get really going on Pinterest?
Well, we talked about the need to have a diverse set of boards. For
Right.
one, you want to have boards that apply to your blogging topic and be specific. So for instance, I talked about social media and internet marketing, but I've got a blog on blogging. I've got a blog on Google Plus and a blog on Pinterest resources and so on. So I got fairly specific there. I've got a blog on email marketing. And as a new blogger, what you don't want to necessarily do is have 15 boards that are empty. So start off with some of these as secret boards. And you can begin to populate these secret boards with pins and then make them public once you feel like they're kind of ready for public consumption. And maybe that's only 4 pins or maybe that's 20. That's going to be up to you and the topic. But that way you can have a strategy in place that isn't necessarily revealed to the world before you're ready for them to see what you're doing.
Gotcha, gotcha. Great advice, Mike. I mean, really great advice. For all you guys watching, I still would love for you guys to go over to manlypinteresttips.com and sign up for being part of our email community. You can, find out when the next show is. For our next show, we've actually got Vincent Ng, who's going to be on next week, and he is an incredible Pinterest strategist. He's really good with Pinterest SEO, so we're going to really pick his brain and have a really great time with him next week. But Mike, before we go, I want you to tell us where we can find you and kind of what you're working on right now.
Sure. Well, I'm on Pinterest, obviously, pinterest.com/Mike Allton. And if you really want to have a great conversation with me, hit me up on Google Plus Mike Allton. That's where I am at, obviously, all day, every day. And what I'm working on right now, as you know, Jeff, is we're working on a blogging course. So later this year, we will have a full online course available for anyone who wants to either get into blogging or take their blogging to the next level. So certainly we'll have more to share on that later on this year.
That's awesome, Mike. Thank you so much again for being here, and we'll make sure all those links are in the show notes, and I hope you guys will show up next time for the Manly Pinterest Tip Show, where we're adding testosterone one pin at a time. See you next time, everyone. Thanks for watching.